Steve, I know it's spooky month and everything, but can you get out of the pile of TVs? We kind of got a video to do.
Okay.
Shadow Wizard Money Gang. We love casting spells.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. What makes music scary? I've noticed something interesting when it comes to horror music in video games. Of course, it had to be about video games. Of course it did, right? Yes and no. The interesting thing about music in general is that it encompasses all kinds of media, right? You could just listen to music by itself. It could be a part of a soundtrack. It could be a part of a video game. It's encompassing. But horror music is different. People don't generally want to listen to unnerving sounds and ambient noises that make you afraid of the dark. When you think of horror music and franchises and stuff like that, you think of the more iconic tunes, the catchy things, the things that we all latch onto in all music. But that stuff isn't scary. Back in the day, on the NES, it suffered brutally from this. And I'm not saying that it didn't have its creepy themes and whatnot, because there are some standout examples we'll get into. But for the most part, all of the horror-themed subject matter was kind of along the lines of being a adventure theme, but it's minor, you know? It's got somber tunes, it's got whatever, but there's still bops. You wouldn't play Castlevania music over something that's supposed to be scary. Just listen to this. So are there any genuine creepy themes on the NES that exist? It's hard to say. It depends on your tolerance for this kind of thing, but some of the closest examples of blending both of those two worlds of that somber, minor, yet catchy, and ambient, actually scary stuff goes to some of the most interesting games on the system. First, you have Sweet Home. Sweet Home, for those who don't know, is a horror game that was released on the Famicom and pioneered some of the things that make Resident Evil what it is today. But the music, when I'm looking back at it, is actually quite astounding for what they went for at the time. A lot of interestingly thought out themes and genuinely upsetting music sometimes, blended with this interesting cadence that makes it memorable. Something special about it. You should check it out. Another instance of this would be Bram Stoker's Dracula on the NES. Now, this one's interesting because it's kind of hard to listen to sometimes, but you can tell there's an intentionality behind it that is so invigorating. Once it plays its hand, it makes itself known how competent it is. At first it sounds like nonsense. At first it sounds like crazy bus nonsense, right? But as it keeps going, it gets more and more competent and more memorable. They're trying to unsettle you at first, and then they draw you in, and then they bring that unsettling nature back into the music. Please do yourself a favor if you're a fan of horror and you're a fan of NES soundtracks and stuff like that. Listen to the soundtrack, because it will surprise you if you let it. Now, we haven't solved the problem at the beginning of the video. We found some tracks that were reminiscent of what energy we're looking for, but they aren't necessarily scary or creepy. So where are those tracks at? The short form answer is video games were not ready for that yet. Nintendo and various other companies struggled to get games to a point to to where adult content was added to the mix. NES is no stranger to horror. However, it's very cartoony horror. It's like watching a Halloween skit or something. It doesn't try to invoke fear, it just tries to invoke the spirit of horror. Because there was a lot of censorship and other things that got in the way of bringing that stuff into video games, they just decided to avoid it altogether so that they could make money. At the end of the day, their business, and they needed to make content that people would actually be able to buy. Not to mention, horror media really wasn't there yet either. It kind of was. It was doing those things, those ambient like trills and stuff like that, but a lot of the big horror franchises were sticking to those more melodic and catchy things like the Friday the 13th, you know, that's a iconic thing that came from Friday the 13th. It's just a sound effect, but at the end of the day, it is music. Another example would be the Michael Myers theme, right? That piano riff is iconic. It's a part of the franchise as a whole. Is it creepy? Yes, but not in the same sense as something like this is. That's from a Mario game, by the way. What the hell were you thinking, Nintendo? Anyways, so what makes music unsettling and scary the way that we know it today? Now, I'm not saying that these things that I'm going to list are the end-all be-all result, but these are what I found to be the most important things. Number 1, tension and suspense. They can be the same thing, or they can be separate. It depends on what the actual piece is. Tension is created when things are left unanswered. If a chord is left hanging without a resolution, that creates tension. Horror tension is created by making you feel that all the time. So, in order to get that, you have to avoid resolution, and you have to avoid making people feel comfortable with your actual composition. Number 2 is dynamics. Dynamics is probably the most important thing and what people will probably turn to immediately when they think of scary music. Being surprised by loud noises is inherently surprising, but it isn't scary. But it is a big part of what makes things have tension. The quietness. It's too quiet. Something is wrong. Something is building in the background. The noises are getting louder. They're getting closer. This stuff builds that tension. It directly applies to the first part. The last ingredient, in my opinion, is building dissonance and avoiding harmony. So once again, harmony is what brings us that peace. It's what brings us back down to earth and roots us into something that we know and love. Whenever you take that away, it becomes unsettling. It becomes something that we need to get away from. So how can we implement all of the things that I'm talking about, all this grandiose whatever, blah, 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 tension, blah, blah, blah. How do we put all of that into old school format? Because if we're thinking about it, a lot of the old school stuff wasn't pulling this stuff off well. Maybe it's not for lack of trying. Let's try and apply all of this stuff to an NES track and see what happens. Oh, hey. Welcome to the Cool Kids section. I've set it up to be like a normal NES. So this just gradually gets louder, and its pitch is being bent very slowly up and down, right? So whenever you play a note, it sounds like this. Then you got this one, which is kind of similar, just it's doing some periodic duty cycle thing here. as well as it has a different wave going on here. So it changes pitch slightly differently, and it's already on a different pitch. But those two playing together create this craziness. But let's hear that one on its own. Okay, so let's hear those two together. We got some really high pitch nastiness going on. I synthesized a scream out of this same instrument. I copied this one. I went in here and placed some notes in a way that makes it so it sounds like a scream. So let's hear this real quick. The next thing is the triangle. So let's see what that looks like real quick. The triangle is creating this really quick pitch modulation that eventually goes back to normal. And it's also, when held very long, it also does a drawn out sweep of pitch. No volume automation, but there is portamento. So whenever another note is playing underneath this note, it will slide up to that note. So we kind of got this like weird slippery bass note that goes on. Let's hear what this sounds like. Ah yes, this is the core ingredient of what for me makes it scary. Okay, I took a note out of Silent Hill's book and created a sample. Okay, and what I mean by that is I took a recording of me breathing. I'll go over it real quick. I pitched it down some, cut out a bit of that, and then this one is a sample of me groaning. Right, but it's also pitched down. This is from a different project I had where I was singing harmonies. But I pitched that down to be very low. Now with all that together, I exported it out and it sounded like this one. It was a creepy sound and I was like, yeah, let's work with this. I then ended up pitching that down and exporting it again. And then I put that file, that export, into its own NES VST. Okay. So in order to do that, you come over this and you set this to DPCM, and then you can load a file into one of 4 samples, right? Now this sample is only about 1.5 seconds long. So it should be, in theory, fine. I've heard longer samples. But whenever you do this kind of thing, it's not practical because it's going to take up a lot of space on the cartridge, but you can do it. And then, for some reason, I can't adjust the volume of this this sample at all. So I went ahead and made a volume automation for that. One of my most tension-building elements in this whole thing. Now, all of that together sounds like this. As you can see, it's created an atmosphere that you generally will not find in NES games, but totally possible. Anyways, back to the video. So that's it. As you can see, there's a lot of ground to cover in this area. There's not a lot of tracks out here that are doing crazy stuff like this. Like I said, I mentioned a couple of outliers to that earlier, but beyond that, you're not going to find anything doing this kind of stuff for old video game music. It's just not very common. Because the NES is so limited, it really makes it impossible to believe that you can achieve something in this way. But if you start to think about it at its core, at its basics, you can do whatever you want. But you gotta start thinking outside the box. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this little adventure into old school horror music and video games, and maybe you got a little kick out of it. On a side note, I make everything you see in these videos, to the scripting, to the video editing, to the drawings, everything you see. So if you enjoy this kind of content, help me out, subscribe, share your friends, whatever you want to do. Just watching the video is enough, honestly. I appreciate it if you got this far. I just want to say thank you to my patrons, which is Clover and Dysnomia. Thank you so much. You guys mean the world to me. And I hope to see you guys in the next video. Happy Spooky Month, everybody, and have a good one. Later.